Presence be lifted upon you and always give you peace. I don't think that was the melody that Aaron used, but we'll pretend it was. Amen.
Thank you so much, Jody, for those kind words. So, at about 5 a.m. one morning this past August, I awoke in Warm Springs, Idaho, in a campground on the second day of a ride with 350 cyclists sponsored by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Together, we had breakfast and then pedaled the some 60 miles to Driggs, where we would experience the eclipse in its totality. So as we approached Driggs on our bikes, we passed makeshift groups of teepees and eclipse gazers with crystals and scopes everywhere. As we entered the town, we were greeted by hawkers of eclipse glasses on street corners. Surreal is the word that came to mind. When we arrived at our camp in Driggs, we assembled in a large field adjoining the airport, eclipse glasses shielding our eyes. As the time drew near, the birds went silent. I'm told that the spiders dismantled their webs. It got darker and much colder as we slipped into the totality. The adrenaline rush was like parachuting. At totality, people all around me were exclaiming, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" We experienced a double dose of awe that day. First, the majesty of the eclipse, and second, being part of it in a large community all sharing it. So as a rabbi, I'm never content to just take it in, right? I got to think, well, what does this remind me of? And I went immediately to the words of Exodus 19, which was read for us this morning, about the people standing on the foot of the mountain. In the Hebrew, you get a much greater emphasis on the fact of the use of the word all. So it says, and all the people who were there in the camp trembled. They stood together at the foot of the mountain. It's easy for that to get lost in the majesty of the smoke and the fire and the horns. They all trembled violently together, it says. Imagine the scene. People gathered at the foot of this mountain, the confusing, frightening, amazing double awe feeling of vertical connectedness and horizontal connectedness at the same time. And the same feeling is evoked in the Christian Bible in Acts 2, which was also read as the story of the Pentecost. By the way, incidentally, Pentecost means 50 days. It's 50 days from Easter. And Sinai happens 50 days from Passover. It's not a coincidence. But again, in the text, if you look closely, when the Holy Spirit enters, it emphasizes how the people, all of them were there, all together in one place. They each saw fire resting on one another. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. Again, if you look closely, there's this equal emphasis not only on the Holy Spirit entering, but also on how all of them were together and seeing the Holy Spirit in each one. And then watching that eclipse while people were exclaiming, "Oh my God, oh my God," I also thought of Moses' final speech, which Jody read to you from Deuteronomy. Begins, "Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem." You are firmly standing here, you plural, are firmly standing here today, all of you. Doubles the word in the Hebrew of all of you, before the Lord your God. And then as you heard Jody read, it goes on to describe in detail the many diverse people that were gathered for that final speech. Tribal heads and elders and everyday people, women, children, foreigners, from the wood choppers to the water drawers, which basically covered most of the professions of the day, even future generations which had yet to be born. And so, like the other two texts, this point paints a picture of solidarity and singularity of the people in that moment of awe, an indescribable moment, a moment where those present were individually and collectively tapped into something much bigger than themselves and into one another at the same time. So it's very easy to see in these texts the awe in the vertical sense, the emotion felt by an individual standing in the presence of God in the mystery. Albert Einstein described it this way: the most beautiful thing, he says, that we can experience is the mysterious. It's the source of all true art and science. To know what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty, which our dull faculties can comprehend only in their most primitive forms. This knowledge, he says, this feeling is at the center of true religiousness. But if we look at these texts a little more closely, we see that they also show us this power of awe in the horizontal dimension, coming from a group dynamic. In modern times, think of Woodstock, or the thousands of pink hats at the Women's March on Washington, or 50,000 people watching their favorite sports team compete. Awe is most powerful, of course, when it's felt in both directions at the same time, vertically and horizontally. And that's when this feeling of call to community is strongest. So in your series on call, I've been asked to speak specifically on call to community, which I've paraphrased for my own purposes as the awe we feel in connecting with community. These experiences surrounding the Sinai revelation and Moses' final speech and the Christian revelation of the Holy Spirit, as well as others in our sacred texts, are profound examples of how people who are being called to God through holy community. And we know that call is authentic by what we feel, the awe aroused when we stand together in solidarity with our community. So as I thought about what I wanted to say to you today about this, I realized first that we live in amazing times, remarkable times. While the press emphasizes every occurrence of religious strife and violence, nary a word is said about the growing interfaith cooperation happening in so many levels. For example, just last year, the rabbinic seminary in which I was ordained entered into a partnership with the New York Theological Seminary, which trains Protestant ministers. And students at each may now cross-enroll in classes at the other. That's remarkable. And here in Little Bozeman, not only do we do all sorts of interfaith work together, but I'm so honored to be invited to offer some words at one of my favorite churches with some of my favorite spiritual leaders. And so I want to thank both of you for the honor and the warm welcome. With that background, and as I was wondering how I might best contribute to the conversation as a rabbi, I thought it best to share a couple of Jewish teachings about these texts. In Judaism, although the individual is of infinite value, the core Jewish covenant is between God and the community of Jewish people, a vertical covenant like we've been talking about. But when we examine the nature of that covenant more carefully, we'll see that at its core is the call to be in a community with one another, a horizontal covenant. So let me explain. There's a Jewish teaching in the Talmud, written roughly the same time as Jesus, about what the Israelites actually experienced at the foot of the mountain that day. Now, if you go on in the text just a little bit past what was read today, it talks about the Ten Commandments and it describes the Ten Commandments, and it makes it sound as if everybody heard God speaking those Ten Commandments. But our sacred text, the Talmud, says it didn't happen quite that way. In fact, the first rabbi who begins the conversation says, really, God didn't speak all 10 of the commandments, just the first two. I am the Lord your God, and there's no other gods beside me. Because if we understand those two really deeply, the others can all be reasoned out from them. Of course, if you understand that I am God and there's no other God, that you'll know that killing and stealing is wrong, and so on. And so really, this rabbi says, they only heard the first two. The rest were obviously reasoned out by them in response. Well, the second rabbi comes along and says, not so fast. Really, they only heard the first one, I am the Lord your God, because if you really get that, you would reason that there's no other gods besides this one, and everything else would follow. And so really all they heard is, I am the Lord your God. Not so fast, says the third rabbi. Why would God have to speak all those words? He just said the first word, Anochi, I am. From that, you know it's God. Of course, he is the Lord your God. You have no other gods before you, and you'd reason out all the rest of them. Not so fast, says the next rabbi. Anochi starts in Hebrew with the letter Aleph, and all that was heard is Aleph. Well, if you don't speak Hebrew, you don't know that the sound of Aleph is silent. That nothing was actually spoken. It was an experience. And they knew from the experience, not any words, that they stood before God with one another. Well, that actually ends that particular conversation, but it gets picked up a little bit later when another rabbi comes along and says, not so fast. You see that letter Aleph consists of 3 pen strokes, one like this and 2 shorter ones. And if you twist it just a wee bit, it looks like a human face, a nose and 2 eyes. And what they really experienced, he says, is the God in one another. That's what happened at Sinai, is they looked into one another's faces and they realized that's where God is. That is the call to community, in my way of thinking. Now, a superficial understanding of the text may lead one to believe that the essence of this covenant is between God and community, but a deeper reading shows that within that covenant is the call to community with one another through the faces of one another. And there is a critical and important consequence of accepting this call to community and experiencing the awe that comes with it. Since the year 2000 or so, there's been any number of studies about the compelling connections between this experience of awe and enhanced critical and creative thinking, ethical decision-making, humility, improved health, and an increase in kindness, self-sacrifice, cooperation, and resource sharing. You see, this awe shrinks our ego, which causes us to feel a greater sense of oneness with one another. And this oneness can make us nicer. For example, some of the studies show that people experiencing awe are far more willing to donate to charity. Hearing and answering this call to community also offers an antidote to one of our most devastating of all human conditions: loneliness. For example, according to this same Talmud in a different passage, during the pilgrimages to the ancient temple in Jerusalem, thousands of people would enter the courtyard in mass. Circling to the right around the perimeter, they would enter through this one door in particular, and they'd immediately circle to the right. But then, one person enters from that same doorway, someone to whom something awful has happened. But he starts to circle in the opposite direction. And every person who passes him is obliged to stop and ask, in Aramaic, Malach, what's going on with you? And that person, surrounded by people and yet totally alone, has to answer, my father died. Made it longer than anyone expected, but the Alzheimer's was awful. He was my best friend in the world. Nobody understood me like he did. Another follows behind him, also walking against the masses. I was just diagnosed with cancer, he says. I'm terrified. My son is in rehab, says the next. My daughter took her own life, the next says. I had no idea she was in so much pain. And those who walk from the right to the left, every single one of them must stop. And their job is to make sure that the mourners and the sick ones and the brokenhearted are all witnessed and seen. May God bring you comfort, they say. May you feel the presence of this holy community and know that you are not alone. What a profound ceremony. When we've suffered loss, when our hearts break with worry, when we get a diagnosis, it can feel like the whole world is moving in one direction and we're moving in another. And in that moment, when all we want to do is go home and be alone, our tradition calls us to show up and voice our struggle. And the community is called to be our witness and offer comfort. Why? Because part of what it means to be a human being is to realize that today you walk from left to right, but tomorrow it's me. I hold you today. Tomorrow you'll hold me. So back to the eclipse. Why is it that the awe of seeing the eclipse felt so much more intense when I'm in a group with others? Well, research shows that the results from seeing our own emotions reflected in the faces of others around us validates our own experience and amplifies the intensity of our feelings. So when we're in religious community, our feelings about God and the universe and how those feelings call us to ethics and service are validated and, where necessary, challenged. It's also an opportunity to connect with strangers. Now, if you ask people what's missing from your life, not many will say emotional intimacy with strangers. But if you ask sports fans what they like most about watching a game in a crowd, intimacy turns out to be a favorite part of the experience. This suggests that many of us who seem not to want to interact with strangers actually do. We just don't know how to make it happen in normal life. And so why is it so much easier to do this in some crowds rather than others? The critical ingredient, researchers say, is a sense of shared social identity. That's something that's pretty much guaranteed in a field of cyclists in weird matching glasses, waiting for the moon to cover the sun. It's also something that can happen when we are called together as a religious community who share a faith, traditions, a liturgy, a history, and a future. Just as the eclipse and the crowd I shared it with gave me a double dose of awe that day, our liturgy and our traditions, performed by timeless generations before us, beginning at Sinai and renewed again in Deuteronomy and again in Acts, renewed by us today as we stand together before God. To use the words from Moses' final speech, we all stand here together today, is designed to give us that same double sense of awe. There's one final, more important element to all of this. I wondered what my pop-up cyclist community was thinking when the sun was fully covered and they repeatedly exclaimed aloud, "Oh my God, oh my God." And why did they need to say it aloud, feeling the need to share their feeling with others? Could it have been just a meaningless expression? Or did they sense what Abraham sensed when he reasoned, much like Einstein, by the way, that there was a beauty and mystery behind and beyond the planets and the stars, behind the eclipse, eclipsed by them, if you like, a mystery and a beauty that is neither a body nor a force nor an eclipse, and that all the stars and the planets and the eclipses are but manifestations of the beauty and mystery of life itself. And did they, having been called to this community, feel that we, too, were part of that amazing system, each of us a small star floating in the vast universe, but connected to every other one there and beyond and to everything else? And by proclaiming it aloud, did they seek to make known that feeling of connection with everyone there, and in turn connect everyone there to that mystery we call God? Maybe my fellow cyclists caught a glimpse of what lay beyond and they needed to share it aloud because they saw what lay beyond in the faces of those gathered and at that moment they knew, really knew, what it meant to be called to community, and specifically the community we had created. My prayer today is that we may all hear that call to come together as community, not just for extraordinary astronomical events, but to see God's revelation in one another's faces and to celebrate and mourn the everyday events of our own lives together and to learn together to love and serve one another. May that be God's will. Amen.